Soueif. Ahdaf Soueif is an acclaimed novelist, critic, translator, and activist. She is the author of the stunning novel In the Eye of the Sun and the best-selling The Map of Love, shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1999. She is also the author of short story collections. Her first book, the acclaimed Aisha, Sandpiper, and I Think of You. Soueif is an Egyptian writer who writes in English from an Egyptian point of view, a writer who is between two cultures, and writes of both England and Egypt from within. In the Eye of the Sun is the great English novel about Egypt, and also the great Egyptian novel about England. Edward Said described her as one of the most extraordinary chroniclers of sexual politics now writing. She is one of the first Arab Anglophone writers and has inspired a new generation of writers in the Arab world. Soueif's eloquent translation of Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti's memoir, I Saw Ramallah, into English was published in 2004. She published an essay collection, Mezzatera, Fragments from the Common Ground, in 2004. Mezzatera is, she writes, this territory, this ground, valued precisely for being a meeting point for many cultures and traditions. In 2012, she published Cairo, My City, Our Revolution, followed by the expanded edition, Cairo, Memoir of a City Transformed, in 2014, a memoir of the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. Soueif is also a political and cultural commentator who writes regularly for The Guardian in London and the Shuru in Cairo. She founded the Palestine Festival of Literature in 2008. Since 2008, PalFest has run an annual festival that has brought together international novelists, dramatists, poets, publishers, agents, and editors, as well as writers from Palestine. She won the Cavafy Award in 2011, the first Mahmoud Darwish Award in 2010, and the Lannan Foundation Award in 2002. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdel Nasser, and thank you, Dr. Balthazar. And I really, I'm very impressed that AUC and the department choose the very prickly subject of human rights, even in regard to literature, for this year's graduate conference. I'm privileged to be with you and privileged to have listened to some of the panelists who were speaking earlier. I've been trying to, obviously, to prepare this talk and so to think full on about the issue of the relationship between literature and human rights. And I found it pretty difficult. Like the more I thought about it, the more I questioned every statement, almost every statement that I read or came up with. And so this is really not going to be a talk with a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion. It's rather going to be a series of observations. And probably like narrative art, it will throw out more questions than answers. I can't promise you that it'll be useful, but I can promise you that it will be authentic and true and heartfelt. And I think, there's probably one sort of general, I'll begin with the general and with general observations, and then if there's time, we can go into personal experience. And I would also say that these remarks are limited to writing as art. In other words, writing as polemic or as journalism or as criticism or research or documentation has its own immediate and clear value and is subject to different criteria anyway, and is not the subject of my questioning today. I'll also say that I'm just very glad that I have a panel full of people that I'm not talking to my own image. So it would be great to keep it this way. Thank you. So to go to the classics straight off, John Keats once described true artists as those to whom the miseries of the world are misery and will not let them rest. If so, then I guess that the artist needs to question, and will always question, whether their art has a function in relation to these miseries. This is a subject that has been, that artists have spoken a lot about what they see as the function of their art. Camus famously, in his Nobel acceptance speech in 1957, talking about how his art needs to reach or to speak of the forgotten prisoner on the other side of the world, for example. But we do, in fact, have testimonies from readers, from the recipients of narrative art, that talk about its importance to them. And sadly, we have very immediate testimonies. We don't need to look very far for people to tell us what narrative art has meant to them in a time of darkness. Think of Abdurrahman al-Gindi. Some of you will know him. He was in prison unjustly for 7 years. He came out 1 year ago. He's a prolific poster, blogger, etc. And he wrote a beautiful tribute on the occasion of Mourid Barghouti's very sad passing away 2 weeks ago, where he paid tribute to both Mourid Barghouti and to Radwa Ashur, and talked of the ways in which their words in their fiction and poetry reached the prisoners in the various prisons that Abdurrahman was in, whether it was in Wadi Gidid for a while or Tora, and what it meant to them, what these words meant to them, and how they felt, so that they knew these writers personally and were being written to personally, and how they mourn their death. I myself, at a humbler level, have many. In fact, I got to know Abdurrahman al-Gindi because he wrote to me from prison. And so I then received notes from him to do with reading my work, and then notes from other prisoners. And it is, I can tell you, an extremely humbling, moving and humbling experience. Just in last December, we had a letter from Khalid al-Jarrar, a very prominent Palestinian prisoner, a lawyer and a politician who's been serving time several times in Israeli prisons, and it was addressed to a literary conference. And she says, we would like to attempt to bring to you our actual experiences with literature and culture while in Israeli prisons. The most important element in this regard is books. Books constitute the foundation of life in prison. They preserve the psychological and moral balance of the freedom fighters who view their detentions as part of the overall resistance against the colonial occupation of Palestine. Books also play a role in each prisoner's individual struggle of will between them and the prison authorities. In other words, the struggle becomes a challenge for Palestinian prisoners as the jailers seek to strip us from our humanity and keep us isolated from the outside world. That's Khalid al-Jarrar last December. One of the features of prison life here in Egypt now is that when the authorities decide to make life difficult for prisoners, one of the things that they deprive them of is books. So along with sunshine, fresh air, exercise, books are also forbidden. And what's interesting is that that it's not just that when the books that people are trying to get into the prison are nonfiction, then they get taken to one side and they get kept and they get looked at as the authorities try to work out whether these are things that, you know, they can think of letting in or not. But novels, there is a blanket no on novels, and that's quite interesting. So so what does narrative art or poetry? I'm going to stay with narrative art because poetry is a bit different and a bit privileged. What does it do for the reader, for the recipient? Well, we generally think that it speaks to us through the function of empathy, that the work, when it works, is a direct connection between the writer's imagination and the reader's, and that together, actually, they create character and scene. The writer triggers it, but needs the participation of the reader for the full realization of character and scene. And in this realization, the reader recognizes. They recognize the human, they recognize themselves, they recognize aspects of other people, things that they have known. And in that recognition, they know in the depths of their being that they are not alone. And I think that this is something that we have all experienced. And I remember my first reading of George Eliot, The Mill on the Floss, when I was 13, and realizing that Maggie Tulliver was me. And then that happening with various other writers, with Edna O'Brien in particular, I think, with August is a Wicked Month. But it's something that we all know, that moment when the text that we're reading tells us that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. I think that this quality, this ability of literary art has been recognized since people began telling stories, really. And then Keats, again, describes it as poetry should strike its readers as a remembrance, a recognition. And as it begins its obscure pilgrimage through memory and conscience, the human condition will be registered at a private, personal level, and yet the experience will involve a sense of common human belonging. So, okay, so I accept that literary art at its best will do that, will stretch out a hand and reach the individual sitting in their own, darkened room or sunny balcony or whatever. But let's go back to that earlier quote from Keats, the one about the miseries of the world. And so my question here is to myself as well as to others, if you are an artist whose heart quivers with these special artists' antennae tuned to the human condition, how can you content yourself with providing company, recognition, solace, balance to your reader? How can you not wonder whether your work can actually make a difference to the miseries of the world that your reader is maybe suffering from? And I was trying to think about why this question seems to be more pressing or more real now. And I wonder whether perhaps the miseries that, if Keats were writing today, would have been what he was talking about, are more specific and maybe have a different profile to earlier ones. What I mean is that writers have always grappled with the human condition, but that I think that there is a difference between offering your reader a response to or an examination of, say, for example, the terrible finality of death, or the ingratitude of your children, or the possible darknesses in desire, on the one hand. And on the other, the torments of the attempted illegal migration, or the indignities of poverty, or indeed the banal mysteries of the torture chamber, all of which are man-made rather than God-given miseries. And I think that the effect on readers that we were just talking about, which when that line is stretched, then people talk about humanizing and ennobling and so on, that's what happens to you when you exercise your empathy muscle a lot. You become a better human being. But I don't know that exercising the empathy muscle is going to work on the authors of our miseries. The politicians, the arms dealers, the Israeli settlers, the company men. I mean, Shakespeare has been around for 400 years, and they are still pushing and pricking the world to its doom. So I think hoping that literature will have an ennobling effect on the people who are the cause, or who are the architects of the system, perhaps, that is the cause of our miseries today. We're talking particularly also in relation to human rights. I think that's not really something that one would want to wait for. So in that case, is it actually right to help the prisoner live a wider or more recognized life in his cell? Or to try to assimilate in however jagged and non-normalizing a way the experience of torture? Or are we actually spraying scent and masking the stench of the slaughterhouse when we should be out there trying to destroy it, to actually pull it down? Well, this question has been put perhaps not in quite this way, but often, and different writers have had different responses to it. So, for example, Joseph Brodsky, one of the poets who escaped. There used to be a particular word for it, but I've forgotten it. When people used to get away, like be out on a literary tour or a ballet tour or something from the USSR, and then stay in the West. Anyway, so Brodsky was one of the poets who escaped from the Soviet Union, and he never doubted the task of poetry. The only defense against evil, he wrote, is complete originality. So you just have to be brilliant. You just have to be as good as you can possibly be about your writing. And that is your defense against evil. Well, complete originality is a tall order, and keenly felt, I imagine, when the variables that inform your work are not only the variables of art. In 2008, in an address to the then newly formed Palestine Festival of Literature, it was a welcoming address to Palfest, Mahmoud Darwish addressed the visiting writers. And speaking of Israel and its attempts to erase Palestinian history, to erase the Palestinians from history and Palestine from the map, he described the difficulty of being a Palestinian poet. Quotation: on the one hand, you have to be true to your reality, and on the other, you have to be faithful to your literary profession. In this zone of tension between the long state of emergency and between his literary imagination, the language of the poet moves. He has to use the word to resist the military occupation. And he has to resist, on behalf of the word, the danger of the banal and the repetitive. How can he achieve literary freedom in such slavish conditions? And how can he preserve the literariness of literature in such brutal times? But Darwish, as we know, did not content himself with literary resistance. He was a leading member of the PLO, and he was the author, along with his friend Edward Said, of the the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, which indeed was adopted by the PLO in 1988. And then, and again with Edward Said, in a major act of resistance to Israel and to all the dominant global powers of the moment, he broke with Yasser Arafat and resigned from the Palestinian National Council in protest at the Oslo Agreement, which the world at that point was applauding. Well, from where we stand today, can we doubt the value to humanity of Darwish's literary resistance in the remaining 15 years of his life when he devoted himself to writing? I think not. The body of work that he has left and his contribution both to literature and to Palestine and the general cause of freedom is immense. And yet, would he have been Darwish had he not been willing, before his resignation, to give so much of himself directly to direct political work and political resistance? Well, our choices are, in their detail, governed by our circumstances. Darwish was resisting a foreign occupation. Sonal Ibrahim and Abdurrahman Munif were resisting homegrown oppression. James Baldwin was resisting racism. Theirs was the literary response to the specific type of violation of human rights that they had experience of, as indeed was so many of the people that you spoke of in the previous very valuable sessions. But things don't have to be that specific. And as I've already said, writers have always written about the human condition. And all the phenomena that are listed in today's list of human rights violations are part of the human condition that writers have variously responded to. And yet, as I said before, I feel a difference in the conditions that we as writers are having to respond to today because of the difference in the conditions of the world. And what is that difference? So my attempt at an answer is 3 items. One is that we have become very aware of the wide spread of brutality. Your papers in this conference are a testament to that. That we are aware of the details of the cruelty of man throughout history and its varied manifestations now, today, across geography. The unknown prisoner, quote, the unknown prisoner abandoned to humiliations at the other end of the world, whose silence Camus, as I said, spoke of in his Nobel acceptance speech in 1957, has been multiplied a millionfold in China, in Myanmar, in Egypt, in the United States, in Guantanamo, in Belmarsh, in the Gulf, you name it. This was probably always the case, but it probably also was not the case that every individual was so exposed to it, had the means by clicks on a machine in their bedroom to know what was being perpetrated in so many different places across the world and to also trace its history backwards. Second point is that we are aware of an all-engulfing threat to the planet itself. And this sense of hurtling towards a cosmic disaster can make any activity not directly related to stopping it seem frivolous. I think the only other comparable time that I can think of was CND, the nuclear disarmament movement after the nuclear bombing of Japan in the Second World War, and how the issue of nuclear disarmament also became like the huge issue at that point. I'm not sure why, but it feels that the threat, the danger, yeah, I guess the threat to the world through the atomic bomb was because somebody might detonate an atomic bomb. And so you wanted to stop them. But the threat to the planet that we are living through now is something that is happening unless something very, very radically different starts happening. So in other words, the process is already very much in place. And the third item is that we now have a clear understanding that the world's woes, the wars, the ethnic cleansings, the oppressions, the decimation of species, the destruction of the planet itself, has its basis in human greed. It's all man-made, and it has its basis in a system that is predicated on and in the service of human greed, and is not only prepared, but finds it beneficial to itself to use violence. And that this can really, I mean, the only hope I think of stopping this or putting the brakes on it is through a hard politics. Which brings me rather neatly to an observation about my title, because I think I should kind of explain where that came from, what's so human about human rights. And I questioned the phrase human rights because, now, bear with me, this is me puzzling over this and getting worked up about it through sort of various nights. I questioned the phrase because on the one hand, it kind of rather slyly shifts responsibility, as though the rights are human, but they're being violated by another species, as though the violator of these rights were not human themselves. And that's problematic. And on the other, because without, really not wanting to sound all kind of new agey, but because where do we, with the violators in our midst, where do we get off claiming rights exclusively for ourselves when it's our own kind who are annihilating other living beings and destroying the planet itself? So, I'm just throwing this out there as a problem because I sort of think that we have a responsibility to problematize phraseology rather than leaving it unexamined. I think it is probably useful. Well, what do we do in the face of all this all-encompassing urgency? In the Mandarins, Simone de Beauvoir asks, the whole book is very much an asking of this question, and the book is a very thinly disguised, or not even disguised, it's a rendition of what was happening among a group of French intellectuals at the end of the Second World War. Now, they had all been members of the resistance. They were all writers, artists, etc., and they had all been members of the resistance and of the underground and gone to great risks to fight the Nazis and the occupation of France. And the war was over and victory was in the hands of France. The Nazis were defeated. And these people were waiting for this wonderful new world that they had fought for to emerge. And it doesn't. And what is actually emerging is, if you like, the counter-revolution. What is actually emerging is the old system just re-establishing its place. And what do you do? So the main male character, Robert, who is Sartre really, is being asked continuously to form a political party, to create a political magazine. In other words, to throw himself into politics. And his partner, Anne, who is Simone de Beauvoir herself, is against this and remonstrates with him and says that for the duration of the war and the resistance, you have put your book on hold. You have an important book to write. You are a writer. And this was all on hold because of the war, because of the resistance, but now that is over, and your contribution to society, to life, to humanity is to write your book, not to get caught up in politics again. And eventually he says to her, but what is the point of writing my book if the world that I want out there, the world that I've worked for, isn't there to read it? Do I write my book, or do I try to work to create the world that we have been dreaming of? And you'll have to read the book to find out what the answer is, or on what side the writer comes down. But it is a very, very powerful question. And to shift slightly into my own experience here, I tried to read the Mandarins when I was in my early 20s, and I just couldn't. I thought it was boring, and they went on, and what was it about? And then I read it 3 years ago, and I couldn't put it down. It seemed, that quality of recognition, of having been there, it seemed to just echo what we here were talking about and were thinking of, and the issues that were at play. So here with me and this issue of are you a writer or an activist, and can you be, theoretically you can be both a writer and an activist. And I would have thought for the longest time that I was a writer. That was what I wanted to be, and it was like a dream come true when I found that I could do it, and when I actually got published and had a readership, and saw my books actually sitting in shop windows. And then when The Map of Love was shortlisted for the Booker, that happened to be towards the end of the year 2000. And that was, of course, the time of the second Palestinian Intifada. And what happened was that that The Guardian invited me to go to Palestine and write a piece of reportage about the Intifada, about the situation there. And that was that would not have happened had the book not achieved the success it had. So that was a direct result of this. And of course, the also result was that I had a platform, that I had readership, that if I published something in the newspaper, people were going to read it. And so there was a responsibility. And of course, a child of the 60s, I was brought up on the Palestinian issue. So I went. I was terrified, but I went, and I was also terrified of the whole question of is this considered normalization? And in fact, I had soul-searching conversations with Edward Said, with Radwa Ashur, with Mourid Barghouti, and so on, about how one could do this and could write about it and bring our voice into the English language media without looking as though one was normalizing. And they gave me very clear guidelines, and that's what I followed, and that's what I did. And that first time in November 2000 in Palestine, as I sat the first night, having walked around, looked around, talked to people, and then back in my hotel room, writing up what had happened that day, I felt in a different, okay, when you're writing fiction, when I was writing fiction, if you're very, very lucky, then there are times, they are few, but they're amazing when they happen, when you really feel that you're writing at full stretch. When it, I mean, you're lucky if it lasts for 2 hours, but where you're hitting the keyboard, everything is coming out just right. And when you print it out, turn it face down and look at it again in the morning, you're like, how did I do this? Who was it who wrote this? And that is just a feeling like nothing else. So that night in Palestine, it wasn't that I felt exactly that, but it was that I felt the equivalent of that in terms of moral responsibility. In other words, it was a high of knowing that whatever skill I had was being used in the service of something bigger, and something bigger that wasn't art or the novel in hand, but something human and existing and bigger, and the people out there. It was an incredible feeling, and it just felt right that this was the right thing that I should be doing. And so even though I never sort of like stepped back and said, I will not write fiction anymore, but that is what happened because I hijacked myself into cultural activism. Although to go back to an earlier point, one of the things that really the trips to Palestine taught me were how much literature means to people, because there were people under occupation. In other words, you couldn't walk out of your town or your village without passing through the checkpoint of the enemy foreigner. You were subject to incursions. Everything about your life was determined by an enemy who was occupying your land. And yet, you really, really cared about not just reading novels and poetry, but about discussing them and about being acknowledged as part of a community in the world that cared about these things, that you were not simply reduced to somebody who was suffering under occupation, somebody who was a victim of occupation, but know that you somehow the engagement and the public and the communal engagement with literature meant that you were bigger than what they were trying to do to you, which I guess is what Khalda Jarrar was saying in her letter as well. So anyway, so basically, what happened was that I used the platform that had been given me by literature, by literary fiction, to work on cultural activism. Eventually creating the Palestine Festival of Literature, which was just all consuming and which was like, a week every year of traveling 25 people around Palestinian cities and towns and sort of basically choreographing a psychological journey for them as well as the physical, at the end of which, without any pushing or force feeding, they would own the Palestinian experience. It would become their own and they would not be able to escape from it, and it would have to show through in their attitudes and in their work. And they were opinion formers and makers of culture. And dovetailing in with this, of course, was the beginning of political activity in Egypt, which also began in 2000 and then flared up again in 2003 with the Iraq War, and then 2005 with the parliamentary elections here and so on, until we get to 2011. And so from 2005, I was also writing about Egyptian politics, and I was also taking part in whatever protests were happening when I was here in Egypt, since I was mostly living in England for family reasons. Until 2011, when it was like, okay, our dreams had come true, and this was really the thing that one would throw oneself into, and that was going to be the meaning of life from then on. And one of the manifestations of this for me was that I found my tongue in Arabic, that it was not as supple or as able a tongue as the English one, but bit by bit it managed to produce a weekly column in Shuru, which was completely used for activism, and which again was using whatever skills I still had as a writer to write about points that were political and that were to do with human rights and to do with social justice and so on. Perhaps had I been a poet, it would have been possible to produce poetry at the same time as cultural activism. Because again, if you're a good poet and if you're very lucky, you can have the thought or the concept or the moment and work on it and produce a piece of work in 3 days, a week, whatever. A novel is a different undertaking altogether. A novel, you're looking, in my case, both my novels took 4 years each, and even if it's less than that, it is still a kind of architectural project. It's something that you have to stay in for months and months and months, and that I always put on the back burner because this article was extremely urgent. This talk was extremely urgent. This event was extremely urgent, and the novel would wait, fiction would wait. So it was never, I'm never going to do it again. In fact, I signed a contract for a novel a million years ago, but it was always, this is going to be done very quickly. This thing I'm working on will be done very quickly, 2 days, 3 hours, whatever. The novel is going to take a lot longer. And so I need to leave it for the moment. I'll start on it next week and next week and next week. Until there was no more room for cultural activism or for activism. There was no more room in the media. There was no more room in the streets. There was no more room to organize. And I didn't see the point of doing any of that outside the country. So here we are, living here in Cairo, and maybe the conditions that we're living in basically force the issue for me. I was looking at the Declaration of Human Rights, and I invite you to look at it. I think that possibly 27 of those rights are being violated constantly here. So under those conditions, I think although the question in theory remains open for me, in reality, my choices have been drastically narrowed down, and I accept that my job now, in the absence of any other, is the attempt to create fiction which engages with the times and with the issues that we're living through. It's not an easy process, and it is a navigation through many of the issues that you were working through and describing today. So let's say, and this is just, the next few lines are just an image of what happens in my head, is, okay, let's try to, surely it's a worthwhile thing to try to capture a sense of what it's like to live this moment. Who? Why do you assume that it's your experience that should be documented? Whose voice, whose story, who will you privilege? Well, yes. And I believe that any work that I do must be a monument to the fallen, to the injured. Well, what does monument mean? A monument can be all sorts of things. But my narrator can't be any of the people whose story I believe deserves to be written. Well, what does deserve mean here? Well, Altras Ahlawi, Shayma Sabbar, Sayyid Wizza, Ahmed Harara, they paid a price. They paid a price, but what did it buy? Yeah, they paid a price, but what we have here is just our local manifestation of something that is sweeping the whole world. Okay, I accept that, but I can't write about the Uyghur, about the Rohingya, or about being a refugee in a capsizing boat or a child in a cage on the American border. So you see how it goes. At this point, my jaw becomes so clenched that I have to stop and remember to open my mouth and give myself a little massage. I'm going to end with a conversation I had with Tamim Barghouti. We've been talking very often since Murid died. Both his parents were great friends of mine, and I think he's a genius. And I was talking about this and talking about the issues, and he reminded me, he said, you know, you can't. I mean, you can only write about what you know intimately. You can only take what you know intimately as your starting point, and you know that. And of course, I know that. We all know that. Anybody who's written or read or thought about critical theory knows that. So he said, for sure, Ala's imprisonment. I'm sure you know that my nephew and niece Ala Abdel Fattah and Sana Asif are both in prison. So for sure, Tamim said, Ala's imprisonment is what cuts into you most. Well, actually, I said, I'm not sure. I think it's bigger than that. I think it's the fact that this can be happening at all, that this can be done to people, to so many people. So Tamim said, but that's an abstraction. You can't write about an abstraction. You can't feel an abstraction. You have to start from something felt. And again, I said, as I've just said, yes, I know. It's from the particular that you arrive at the universal. And then something was triggered in me. And this is my end. As I said this, the image that came into my mind was that of my sister. Now, obviously, we all, in our different ways, are living through the circumstances that we have here, and we find ways of dealing with them. And my family, with all the bits and pieces that are happening, we deal with them, and we obviously have to be very normal and to laugh and to do things practically and to discuss logistics. But at the same time, we have to be careful not to normalize, not to accept that this is how things are and this is normal and should not be resisted. And that's what we do. And of course, again, that's what you have to do, I guess, when you try and write about it. But the image that came, and so we normalize. And so, you know, people say, oh, you're having a hard time. And I think, and say, well, actually, no, I mean, you know, not in any way that's different from anybody else having a hard time. But there was a moment 5 weeks ago in the hearing for my niece, for Sana, who's 26, when it was the hearing where they were going to listen to witnesses. And the issue was whether she had been present outside the gate of the prison at a particular point or not. And she hadn't. She had been up at the coast, but the accusation was that she had been there and she had insulted a police officer. And the witness that got up to speak was my sister. Now, obviously, I'm seeing my sister all the time. I'm listening to her talk all the time. عادي. But that moment, as she was standing in front of the judge and giving an account of what happened that day, I also saw all that had happened to her since 1981, I guess. And it hit me. I got very cold and I started to shake and I just couldn't stop the tears coming back. And that was dreadful, but it was also good because it told me that I hadn't normalized, that it was just the right image that would awaken the feelings. And also, as I was writing this piece and I thought of this, I thought, this is what has to happen when you try to produce a work of art out of what we are living through, that you have to allow your reader to breathe, to live through it with you, and then to find the image that actually does not normalize and does not rationalize and does not aestheticize the thing that we are passing through from time to time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a rich and thought-provoking address. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to have Ahdaf Soueif with us today, albeit we're all virtual, and it's such a great pleasure and privilege to have you. Thank you so much. We have a panel at 2, so would you like us to meet in a few minutes at 2 for a panel? It's a panel on women's rights, children's rights, and LGBTQ rights.
And I think we can push the panel back by about 10-15 minutes if you have to, because I assume people have questions and would like to sort of comment and give feedback.
Okay. So do you have questions? Comments? Yes. Okay, it's Christopher.
Hi, I am a political scientist, so forgive the naivete of this question. It was a very powerful address, and there's something that I have on my mind, and I was wondering if you could help me solve this problem. So in some cases, with some novels, there's an obvious connection between what you've called an empathetic humanism and the subject of the novel. I was thinking something like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, but James Baldwin's work would work very well. And I was reading Said on Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Kipling's Kim, and I was wondering if there was a place for a novel of inquiry, a Bildungsroman, or a zetetic novel, which means like a novel of searching, that may take place in an environment of social justice, but may not actually advance social justice. And so to just put it in a nutshell, is there still value in a novel whose goal is knowledge or a change in the self rather than a change in the world and social justice? Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think that's really a question that's at the heart of what we're thinking about. And I would say, yes, I would say there is value. I would say that anything that is authentic and does what it does really, there is room and there is value for that. I can't imagine a work like that actually promoting social injustice, I guess. And so inquiry and description rather than change is, yeah, it's valid if you're content, if the writer is content to do that, then yes.
And if I can just ask, given how you ended your address, so polemically, is that the only novel of value in the sense that what we really know is ourselves situated in our environment?
Well, I think what I was trying to reach for was that it is when we write truly about ourselves situated in our environment, we reach something much bigger. I mean, if you think of the greats, you know, any of them, they were writing very specifically about something in their environment, but through that, you reach a universal because of this quality of human empathy. So yes, and I would also say that with regard to your first question, I think I made it clear. I don't think that novels are going to change the world, and so we'll be content with whatever a novel manages to do, I reckon.
Okay, Balthazar, Dr. Beckett.
I just wanted to ask, because you told us how in prisons in Egypt, there's a fear of narrative, right? A fear of fiction, a fear of the novel. And I was contrasting that when I was listening to you, I was contrasting that to sort of my own experience, like working in prisons in California, where it's almost like the prison guards, right? The sort of, the authorities do not fear fiction any longer. They do not fear text any longer. You can bring in whatever you want to, as long as there's no images. And it's all like about the title of the work and the images. And it almost feels like in the States, I sometimes have this feeling that like narratives have sort of, to some extent, lost that bite. I mean, there's like sort of on the right wing, I think there's narratives are employed very sort of very effectively sometimes, but I feel there's a fear of images, of videos, right? Like that sort of sparks has in recent times sort of sparked uprisings. But it sounded to me like what you're describing is that maybe in Egypt that is different, that maybe sort of narrative still has a bite there that it doesn't have in the States, or does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, in a way, I think that the general regard for the general way in which people or the authority regard the novel in America now is not as a political thing. They don't look at a novel and think, what's its politics? Because actually the American novel has moved away from politics recently. So of course, it's there in Baldwin and so on, but it's not in the air now. That's one thing. And the other thing is that I think the authorities here just distrust everything. I mean, unless they have actual reason to trust it, to think this is okay, then they distrust it. And so, if a book says, 50 nice, harmless recipes, they will let it in because they know what this is about. But if it's a novel, how do they know what it's about? But yeah. And writing is suspect here. I mean, the arts are suspect, culture is suspect, writing, journalism. I mean, they suspect. I mean, that is a whole realm of suspicious activity. So, of course, that translates into stopping the books going into prison.
Maybe I was also thinking about, if I can add one more question to it, or like a statement is, when I was reading your son's book, right? When I came back to Egypt after having been gone for 10 years and I didn't recognize anything anymore, right? And I was reading The City Always Wins, right? And I hadn't read a book in a long time that had such a bite, that really was like troubling, that really kept me up at night. And I wondered if there was somebody who channeled that collective experience, right? And produced a book that I haven't read in the States for a long time, a book that was so troubling, right? And so like visceral to me.
Yeah, well, yeah, as a mother and as a critic, I'm delighted that you say so. I agree. I think it's very, very powerful. He and I and close people felt that it was brilliant that he had managed to grab a particular moment, actually, in 2014, and just sort of lock himself away and write it and get it done, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened. And it is a tremendously valuable and powerful book. Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Thank you.
Kumail, you have a question?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't know how to use any gestures, or I'm blind. I'm using voiceover, so so alhamdulillah, and I'm so good. So sorry if you can let me tell me when to talk. Really sorry for interruption. I just gonna comment a quick comment.
Yes, you can. Yes, if you have a question or a comment, yes, please.
It's a comment. And I just want you to know that thank you so much for giving me reassurance and giving me hope in these bad time. I'm a student in Malay studies. I just want to thank you for the inspiring words. That's all. Thank you so much. It was really inspiring and give me hope. We.
You are beyond generous. It's a privilege to.
I'm honored to be with you always.
Area as you and to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Other questions?
I had a comment, if you don't mind. So again, thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts with us. I found it very enlightening, and I'm sure others did as well. Regarding your point earlier on regarding if empathy can succeed in swaying the opinions of people who are proactively oppressing others or causing suffering to others, I have a pessimistic take on this because I'm an anthropologist. I'm studying anthropology, and in history, of course, anthropology has not been very kind. And especially in terms of colonial anthropological works that were done, we see, even though there's a deep understanding of native cultures, regardless of this level, this depth, we see this being used as a guide to cause devastating colonial projects. But of course, there are various examples to the contrary, so I don't want to hearken too much on the pessimistic side of this.
Okay, so that's a comment, right? Yeah, fine, that's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for your inspiring address and novels and nonfiction. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser. Thank you, Dr. Balthazar. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for being a lovely audience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
it was actually
so
when I suggested your name, everybody said she's a friend of our department, and it would be an honor for all of us to have you. So I'm glad this worked out.
Well, I'm very glad. When you invited me, I thought in 3 weeks he's going to call and say, actually, we can't do it because this is what's happening with every program. But obviously you're very powerful in your department, and you pushed it. So thank you.
No, I think it was a collective decision, and everybody was supportive of you being our keynote speaker. So I'm glad this worked out.
Thank you so much.
We're very honored.
Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.